The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber crackled with tension as Clarence Thomas's face contorted with rage, his famous judicial composure completely shattered. "This is the same high-tech lynching I faced in 1991, he shouted, his voice breaking with fury. But Jasmine Crockett remained perfectly calm, holding a folder thick with financial documents as she delivered the words that would trigger the first impeachment proceedings against a sitting Supreme Court justice. "You're not being lynched, Justice Thomas. You're being held accountable. And the only tradition you're upholding is corruption dressed in a robe." The gallery erupted as Thomas stood frozen, realizing his 3 decades of hidden corruption had finally been exposed. The confrontation that would shatter the Supreme Court's untouchable mystique brought together two figures representing the collision between judicial impunity and democratic accountability. Clarence Thomas, the longest-serving current justice, had spent 32 years on the court building a legacy of dismantling civil rights while secretly accepting millions in unreported gifts from billionaire benefactors. His notorious silence during oral arguments masked a web of financial entanglements that influenced his most consequential decisions. Jasmine Crockett embodied the communities Thomas's rulings had devastated, a former public defender who had witnessed firsthand how his decisions gutted voting rights, destroyed affirmative action, and stripped regulatory protections while he enriched himself through his position. This unprecedented hearing would expose how the highest court in the land had been corrupted by its longest-serving member. The hearing had been called following explosive ProPublica investigations revealing Thomas's 20-year relationship with billionaire Harlan Crow, including luxury trips worth millions that Thomas had never disclosed. Thomas arrived at the hearing with characteristic arrogance, treating the subpoena as an insult to his dignity. His opening statement dripped with condescension, dismissing the proceedings as a partisan witch hunt designed to undermine the court's independence. He invoked his confirmation hearings from 1991, claiming he was once again facing persecution for being a conservative black man who refused to conform to liberal expectations. His tone suggested he viewed the entire hearing as beneath him, an annoyance to be endured rather than a legitimate inquiry into judicial corruption. When Crockett's turn to question arrived, Thomas's dismissiveness turned to open hostility. Before she could finish her first question about disclosure requirements, he interrupted with unprecedented aggression for someone who famously remained silent during court proceedings. "Representative Crockett, you're disrespecting centuries of judicial tradition with this theatrical inquisition. Junior members who've never sat on a bench shouldn't lecture those who've shaped American law for decades." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having the final word, expecting deference even from Congress. "Your line of questioning shows inexperience with how the court actually functions. Perhaps you should spend less time performing for social media and more time understanding the Constitution you claim to defend." The insult hung in the air as several senators shifted uncomfortably. Thomas had miscalculated, believing his position made him untouchable, that his seniority and judicial status would intimidate a freshman congresswoman. But Crockett had spent years in courtrooms facing hostile judges, and she wasn't impressed by robes or rhetoric. She calmly opened her folder and began presenting evidence that would systematically destroy Thomas's carefully maintained facade of judicial independence. She started with a timeline of Thomas's trips with Harlan Crow, each one meticulously documented with flight records, yacht logs, and resort registrations. Private jets to Indonesia, where Thomas stayed at Crow's luxury compound. Yacht cruises through New Zealand, where Thomas was the only guest besides Crow's family. Annual stays at Crow's private Adirondacks resort, where membership cost more than most Americans earned in a year. The total value exceeded $4 million, none of it reported on Thomas's financial disclosures, despite clear legal requirements to do so. The committee room grew increasingly quiet as Crockett presented case after case where Thomas had ruled in favor of Crow's business interests without recusal. 12 separate cases where Crow's companies were party to the litigation or had filed amicus briefs, and Thomas had voted in their favor every single time. She showed how Thomas's opinions in these cases directly benefited Crow's real estate empire, his conservative think tanks, and his political organizations. The pattern was undeniable. Thomas was delivering judicial favors to his billionaire benefactor while claiming these were principled constitutional positions. But Crockett was just getting started. She presented evidence that Ginny Thomas, the justice's wife, had received $680,000 from conservative organizations that regularly filed briefs in Supreme Court cases. These payments were routed through her consulting firm, Liberty Consulting, which appeared to have no actual clients besides groups seeking influence over her husband's decisions. Crockett read from Ginny's own emails to these groups, promising access and understanding, and assuring them that their interests would be protected at the highest levels. The first major twist came when Crockett revealed something that hadn't been reported, a secret annual payment system that had been funneling money to the Thomases for over a decade. Through forensic accounting of shell companies and dark money groups, she had discovered that Thomas was effectively receiving a supplemental salary of $1.5 million per year, doubling his judicial income while claiming financial hardship to justify accepting gifts. The payments were structured to avoid disclosure requirements, routed through Ginny's consulting firm and various nonprofits before reaching accounts controlled by the Thomases. Crockett presented emails between Ginny Thomas and major conservative donors that explicitly discussed this arrangement. One email from a billionaire donor stated, "The annual arrangement continues as discussed. We trust Clarence understands our priorities for this term." Ginny's response was damning. "He's fully aware and aligned. The Second Amendment and administrative state cases will go our way." Another exchange discussed specific cases pending before the court, with Ginny assuring donors that Clarence would deliver as always. The most explosive revelation was an email chain from 2021 where Ginny promised a Catholic organization that Clarence would ensure Roe falls this term if they maintained their financial arrangement. The email included a spreadsheet showing payments totaling $3 million over 3 years, timed to coincide with key abortion cases reaching the court. The same organization had filed briefs in Dobbs v. Jackson, the case that overturned Roe v. Wade, with Thomas voting exactly as they had paid him to vote. Thomas attempted to interrupt multiple times, but Crockett continued relentlessly, presenting evidence of a systematic corruption scheme that had influenced dozens of the court's most consequential decisions. She showed how Thomas had failed to report gifts from at least 6 other billionaires besides Crow, including private jet flights, luxury vacations, and even a $267,000 RV that Thomas laughably claimed was for camping. Each revelation built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of a justice who had sold his vote to the highest bidder while hiding behind the court's prestige. The climactic moment arrived when Crockett addressed Thomas's invocation of lynching. Her voice carried the moral authority of someone whose ancestors had actually faced racial terrorism, unlike Thomas, who had weaponized their suffering to deflect from his corruption. "Justice Thomas, you invoke lynching while sitting in a seat you obtained despite credible sexual harassment allegations. You invoke lynching while taking bribes from billionaires. You invoke lynching while stripping voting rights from the descendants of actual lynching victims. You've spent 32 years using your race as a shield while stabbing your own people in the back with your pen." She continued, her voice rising with controlled fury. "You gutted the Voting Rights Act while vacationing on a billionaire's yacht. You destroyed affirmative action while your wife collected checks from white supremacist organizations. You expanded gun rights while black children die from gun violence at rates that would horrify your benefactors if they cared to notice. You've perverted judicial independence into judicial impunity, turned constitutional interpretation into a bidding war, and transformed the Supreme Court into a subsidiary of whoever writes the biggest check." The committee room was completely silent as Crockett delivered her final, devastating assessment. "You're not being lynched, Justice Thomas. You're being held accountable. Real lynching victims didn't have lifetime appointments, million-dollar bribes, or the power to destroy civil rights with a pen stroke. They had their lives stolen by racial terrorists while the law looked away. You've spent 3 decades being that law that looks away, except you're looking at your bank account while black Americans suffer under your decisions. The only tradition you're upholding is corruption dressed in a robe." Thomas exploded, standing and shouting incoherently about persecution, his famous silence replaced by desperate rage. "You know nothing about judicial independence. I've served with distinction for 32 years, while you've been in Congress for 2. This is a high-tech lynching by liberals who can't accept a black conservative. You're destroying the court's legitimacy with these lies." His face was contorted with fury, spittle flying, as he continued his tirade, but his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence Crockett had presented. Crockett waited for him to exhaust himself, then calmly presented one final document. "Justice Thomas, this is a letter from the Judicial Conference of the United States, delivered this morning. Based on the evidence presented today, they're referring you to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation into honest services fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit bribery. The House Judiciary Committee will be introducing articles of impeachment tomorrow. Your 32 years of corruption are over. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, his mouth opening and closing without producing words. Then, in a moment that would define the end of his judicial career, he turned and stormed out of the hearing room, pushing past security and reporters. As he reached the door, he turned back and shouted, "This isn't over. You'll regret this." But his threat sounded more like desperation than defiance. The image of a Supreme Court justice fleeing like a common criminal while threatening a congresswoman became the defining visual of judicial corruption finally facing consequences. Within minutes, the confrontation dominated every news platform. Legal scholars called it the most significant moment in Supreme Court history since Marbury versus Madison. The evidence Crockett presented triggered immediate action. The DOJ opened a criminal investigation, the House began impeachment proceedings, and the Senate started preparing for a trial. Even conservative legal commentators couldn't defend the clear evidence of bribery and corruption. The Federalist Society distanced themselves from Thomas, claiming they had no knowledge of his financial arrangements. The public response was overwhelming. Protests formed outside the Supreme Court demanding Thomas's immediate resignation. Every case he had participated in over the past 20 years came under scrutiny, with civil rights organizations filing motions to rehear cases where Thomas's vote had been decisive. 3 other conservative justices announced they would begin disclosing all gifts and travel, trying to distance themselves from Thomas's corruption. Chief Justice Roberts, who had long protected Thomas, issued a statement saying the court would cooperate fully with investigations. By the next morning, 37 House members had signed onto articles of impeachment. Senators who had defended Thomas for decades suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts when asked for comment. Republican leaders privately urged Thomas to resign to avoid the spectacle of an impeachment trial. Major conservative donors pulled funding from organizations associated with the Thomases. Ginny Thomas was served with subpoenas from multiple committees and a grand jury. The entire conservative legal movement found itself under scrutiny for its role in facilitating judicial corruption.